So today I'll be speaking about words, images, and the subaltern in post-colonial graphic novels. The examination I hope to do will lie at the subject, at the intersection of history, art, and critical theory. And so the question I began to think of was the representation of the subaltern in post-colonial narratives, particularly graphic novels, and the famous question of Spivak, Gayatri Spivak, can the subaltern speak? And in how many ways we can see this question, especially using the definition of Spivak of the subaltern. You know, as we know, Spivak describes the subaltern not just as someone that is oppressed by European colonialism, but refers also to those who are doubly oppressed, silenced both by colonial powers and by indigenous hierarchies. And so, for me, it presents a bit of a challenge to say, how do we, in the face of this overwhelming legacy of colonial narratives, how are we able to tackle the indigenous hierarchies that are as dangerous to the most marginalized in our societies, as we do the work of world building, as we do the work of, you know, for want of a better word, decolonizing. Within the African context and among black people, this would often include, of course, people, you know, at certain marginalized intersections, whether they are LGBTQ individuals, economically marginalized people, women, and all of the other people who have been forced into marginal positions, whose voices have been frequently erased or misrepresented in dominant narratives. So today, I also want to go back to the danger of speaking for the subaltern, even as we gather in places like this. If we remember that famous essay, I mean, to Spivak's mind, there are certain people that do not constitute the subaltern, even though they lie at certain marginalized identities. You know, I can be an African in Europe, but enjoying certain levels of privilege that may not put me in the position of the subaltern, that doubly oppressed by indigenous hierarchies and colonial hierarchies. And so even as we gather in these nice institutions here, and we might be black and whatever, we must remember that, in fact, there are people that are so marginalized that even for us to purport to speak for them is also inflicting violence on them. And we see that in representation in words and images, and we'll talk about that in graphic novels. But before that, historically, European comics and visual media, we know this very well, perpetuated racist caricatures of Africans that reinforced colonial ideologies. We remember the 1931 Belgian publication, Tintin in the Congo, which depicted Africans as childlike, ignorant, subservient, aligning with the paternalistic, civilizing mission narrative that Yvonne referenced in her talk. We also saw, for example, lots of colonial posters and advertisements that portrayed the continent as one of exoticism and savagery and so on and so forth. But we know also that in the mid-20th century, African creators began to reclaim the medium, using comics and graphic novels to challenge these and assert control over narratives. We know of the early pioneers like Sol Plaatje, for example, who blended art and activism. And even in more modern times, popular comics like Nigerian publications like Ikebe Super, Papa Ajasko, that used humor to critique societal norms, as problematic as those publications were. And so, to this day, we have African graphic novels by very young, and African comics by very young artists and writers that push the narrative to even more expansive ground. So, for example, we have people that are have moved away from the early, some would say, obsession with the nation and nation building, post-colonial nation building, if you think of writers like Achebe and Ngugi, to more individual intersections of oppression. So, for example, people saying, what is my individual identity and how am I oppressed by both colonial hierarchies and indigenous hierarchies? And so people have tried to subvert the colonial gaze, center marginalized communities, and revive oral traditions. We know of comics like Anansi the Spider that served as a bridge between oral storytelling and modern media. But I wanted to go back a bit to how graphic novels allow us to see, but also this definition of the subaltern and how many of us are implicated in these hierarchies. In postcolonial comics representing the subaltern by Dominic Davis, I would like to read this quote because it sort of sets the tone for what I'm about to say. Dominic says, comprised of multiple panels, in comics, the reader's attention is constantly drawn to the gutters or the gaps in between that separate the sequential images. Here, readers have to fill in the blanks, linking the preceding image to the following one to build narrative continuity, a process necessary for the comic to make sense. This also means that readers must consider what is not included on the comics page, just as much as what actually appears before them. And so they must pay attention to the way in which each image is itself framed, and fundamentally require that readers are tuned to the processes of representation and how these relate to the reproduction of stories, to the reproduction of cultures, the reproduction of histories, and the telling of the stories of people. And so, as readers of comics, and the same for post-colonial critics, there has to be, or there is a constant interrogation of the narrative's contingency, fragmentariness, and lack of totalization. And he finishes by saying, post-colonial comics not only recover undocumented subaltern experiences, but show, on one hand, how we take stories and experiences for granted, and on the other, how we take for granted that some stories never get told. So who is this subaltern that we talk about? And what is the danger of representation even for us? Not looking out now, but looking within. As Spivak reminds us, the subaltern cannot speak within existing hegemonic structures, and that their voices are silenced by both external and internal forces. And so in trying to represent the subaltern, there is also a danger of reinforcing these silences, even though some of us might fall into these intersections. I think of the country in which I was born, Nigeria, and I think of how in colonial Africa, European powers did not only exploit, but they also entrenched pre-existing indigenous hierarchies to their advantage. In Nigeria, for example, the British partnered with the Sokoto Caliphate in the north, reinforcing its dominance while directly ruling southern territories. This collaboration altered pre-colonial power dynamics, entrenching some disparities that persist today. Thus, the subaltern in Africa is often shaped by overlapping layers of oppression, pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial, if that term exists, as we've heard. And so for those who are scholars, creators, those who study the work of graphic novels, reflexivity is crucial. Because in attempting to represent the subaltern, the risk of speaking for rather than listening to must be actively avoided. In trying to expand the narratives of oppression, I think of something I like to call multiple colonialisms. Now, what for me Spivak's analysis of subalternity encourages me to do is to pursue a nuanced examination of how systems of hegemony operate beyond the binary of colonizer and colonized. and in interrogating what I term multiple colonialisms, we must account for systems of domination that predated, coexisted with, and even intersected with European colonialism. Some of these layers of power shaped lives long before European incursions, often reinforcing indigenous hierarchies that persisted under and were sometimes co-opted by colonial powers. I, at this point, would go to the Sokoto Caliphate, which really emphasizes the point I'm trying to make. Spivak's concept of epistemic violence, the erasure or distortion of marginalized voices within dominant discourses, applies equally to histories shaped by non-European hegemonies. Spivak warns, for example, against replacing one silencing force with another. And by her logic, any genuine attempt to understand subalternity must include these overlapping and intersecting systems of domination. The Sokoto Caliphate, for example, which was established in 1804, provides a striking example of this at work. Emerging from the Islamic reformist jihad of Uthman Fodio, the Caliphate implemented a model of governance that drew on Islamic law and traditional hierarchies. Within this ostensibly just and grounded system, vast layers of oppression proliferated. Slavery under the Sokoto Caliphate before the Europeans was not merely an unfortunate event that befell certain hapless people. It was an institution central to the existence and perpetuation of the Caliphate. The Caliphate was essentially a slave economy. Individuals were captured not merely in jihad, but also by slave raiders who fed slave markets. And these slaves came from non-Muslim communities and were subjected to profound dehumanization. Young boys abducted during slave raids were castrated to serve as eunuchs for rulers, their fates sealed by their ethnicity, religion, and the conditions of their birth. Women and girls existed within a system of concubinage, bearing children for their owners under laws that categorized them as half-persons or minors with limited rights. Enslavement was the state policy, and we see that in the documents in Sokoto, for example, under which, in the religious law and life in Sokoto, the slave systems were very well established. Now, when British colonial forces entered the Sokoto region in the early 20th century, they did not completely dismantle the caliphate system of slavery or governance entirely. Instead, they co-opted its existing power structures through indirect rule. By aligning with local hegemonies, the British reinforced these indigenous hierarchies, perpetuating the marginalization of certain ethnic and social groups. This resulted in a compounded system of oppression, indigenous hierarchies sustained under the aegis of colonial government. For me, multiple colonialisms matter because it is not because it's an attempt to compare oppressions or establish a hierarchy of suffering. Instead, it is a call for some attention to systems of domination that intersect and reinforce one another. This subaltern is silenced, as we said in the beginning, not just by external forces, but also by internal forces. The eunuchs that were castrated to serve as, the boys that were castrated, rather, to serve as eunuchs, the women enslaved as concubines, the stories that were erased within the indigenous pattern of storytelling. So, for example, I remember reading papers from the time of the caliphate and the stories of not just the rulers, but the rebels that sought to dismantle these indigenous hierarchies, and how they themselves created new layers of oppression. For example, one of the rebels in what is now northeast Nigeria, called Hamza, rebelled against this Sokoto Caliphate, which itself rebelled against the Hausa kingdoms that purportedly deviated from Islamic law. What did not happen was a telling of the story of the wife of Hamza, who herself outlived Hamza by over 25 years. And of course we can ask questions about why we do not have the stories of the slave women who passed on knowledge, for example, of abortifacients, who passed on knowledge of medicine and all of that, that allowed for certain classes of slave women to survive these slavery systems, which were themselves compounded by colonial incursion. And so in retelling our stories, the question then is, as we respond to these external colonial influences and forces, how do we respond to the indigenous hierarchies that exist with or without European incursion? Because our story is not complete without interrogating our own indigenous hierarchies, our own systems of oppression, not in comparison to the European. Of course, scholars are doing that work. But if we are to tell a story about ourselves, then it must be a complete story. Often, the temptation is to be reactionary and say, in reaction to the erasure of our stories by Europeans, we present this lionized image of our own history, where in fact we did not have these indigenous hierarchies. For me, the implication for scholarship is to move beyond, in my opinion, European critiques of colonialism and engage with indigenous systems more, especially before European dominance. This requires the uncovering of suppressed voices of those subjugated within local hierarchies, these doubly silenced people who suffer under indigenous systems and then by narratives of European colonial powers. And how, for me, does this relate to African comics and graphic novels? For example, we see that in the rewriting of stories, African stories, this subaltern can themselves be swallowed by these larger narratives that seek to speak against what Europe has done to our stories. And so we ask, who are the doubly marginalized among ourselves? As we fight against European colonialism, how do our indigenous hierarchies harm those that we do not see? And when we stand in nice universities like this, do we consider ourselves, within our context, having a degree of privilege that warrants introspection, that says, who are those who do not exist? Just a very, very simple example. I remember relating with some people in the Hausa department in Bonn, and there was this retelling of the great stories of Hausa land that, of course, reinforced indigenous oppressions. In Hausa language, for example, to say a person has died, we use the word that is derived from Arabic, mutu. But of course, the influence of Islam has meant that that word has been replaced with a word called rasu. Rasu is the equivalent of to lose a person. So if we say ya rasu, meaning he's dead, but it also means we have lost them. Rasu from the word rashi, meaning to lose. Now, what's the difference between that and mutu? What has happened is that after the Islamic Jihad and the way Hausa language was affected by this reinforcement of Islam, the word mutu started to be used to refer to non-Muslims. And it was the same word that was used to refer to the death of animals. And so when somebody was translating a book that they thought, oh my God, this is so great for the reclamation of Hausa language, they inadvertently, when talking about Muslims, used the word mutu, used the word rasu, and when talking about non-Muslims, used the word mutu that they would use to describe the death of animals. And I remember challenging this editor, and I said, why do you separate, when you're talking about Muslims, you say, San Rasul, they died. But when you talk about non-Muslims, heathens, infidels, people who, under the Sokoto Caliphate, would be perfect fodder for slavery. After 1804, Mohammed Bello, the Caliph, outlawed slavery in Muslim lands. And so you were not allowed to enslave a Muslim person. But you were allowed to enslave a non-Muslim. You were allowed to turn a non-Muslim woman into a concubine. You were allowed to treat women who were concubines differently from the way you would treat your wives. You could treat them with this complete disregard and disdain because they were not complete human. And so in telling the story today, we see this replication of this, which this Hausa editor did not even acknowledge that existed. And when I confronted him, he said, no, you're just making a fuss. These two words mean the same thing. But I say, you consistently use the word for the death of an animal for non-Muslims, but the death of a believer for Muslims. And so it is this kind of examination of our languages, of the baggage that comes into the images we produce, that comes into the stories we tell, even in the retelling of stories. I also remember being challenged by this Hausa professor, I think in Hamburg, white German professor who was, a big believer in African languages and making sure that we talk about Africa as great and Europeans as nothing, and they destroyed all of us. And I said, Hausa is the language of my second colonization. And he was more upset than any of the Nigerians there. He stood up and said, no, how can you call Hausa colonial? Because he's a professor of Hausa, and for him, he's like a champion of Africa and of black people, And this is what we mean by the doubly oppressed. As we try to create the new world, I think that Yvonne talks about, we cannot escape our own indigenous hierarchies, the people who suffer under us. And it's with this eye that I look at graphic novels and say, for example, the graphic novel that talked about the story of Shaka the Zulu, for example. Is Shaka the Zulu the subaltern? I don't think Spivak would call him that. But then, of course, there's Aya, that talks about women, young women in Ivory Coast, for example, and Cote d'Ivoire, stories that challenge stereotypical depictions of African womanhood within the context of that tradition. Or more contemporary works like Kwezi by Loyiso Mkize that blends sort of superhero tropes with African cultural motifs, sort of presenting this empowered representation of black identity. For me, I think that I'll end this by talking about another intersection of power, publishing, and the image of the subaltern, especially in publishing graphic novels. For me, publishing in general, whether you're a small black publisher or you're one of the big major ones in the US, publishing itself lies at the core of cultural hegemony, because it controls not just the dissemination of knowledge, but also the narratives that are deemed worthy of public attention. For the subaltern, particularly the black African subaltern, the publishing industry serves as both a gateway and a barrier. It determines who is heard, whose stories are told, whose experiences resonate with audiences. And so this dual role places publishing at the heart of the struggle for representation, especially in the images we see in graphic novels. If we think of how expensive it is, for example, to produce a graphic novel, and how few publishers would undertake that task, then this cultural role of publishing becomes even more important. Now, Gramsci's concept of cultural hegemony suggests that dominant groups control societal norms by shaping cultural production. And for me, publishing exemplifies this. as the economic and cultural capital required to produce and distribute books, especially, like I said, resource-intensive ones like graphic novels, are concentrated in the hands of just a few people. And so for the subaltern, this means that their narratives are mediated through gatekeepers whose decisions are, to some degree, influenced by marketability and profit. And so Spivak's question, can the subaltern speak, particularly becomes relevant here. In the case of the Black African subaltern, the narratives that reach global audiences often prioritize this mainstream conversation of colonial oppression while downplaying indigenous forms of subjugation. This prioritization aligns with market forces. Stories of colonial exploitation, European colonial exploitation, align with established global discourses of victimhood and resistance. And so while nuanced accounts of ethnic, sexual, or class-based oppression within African societies might be marginalized or relegated as too niche or too localized, even if you're talking to African publishers. You know, they say, well, this story, you know, we need to bring it in. We have to sell this book, because in the end, publishing is a business. So graphic novels with their intricate visual and intertextual intricate visual and textual interplay require significant sources to produce. The reliance on publishers for funding, distribution, and promotion traps subaltern authors in cycles of economic dependency. While the internet and self-publishing platforms have democratized access to some extent, they lack the reach, prestige, and infrastructure of established publishers. Even within publishing, authors compete for limited opportunities. This intense competition reinforces in existing hierarchies, narratives that align with global expectations of African stories, stories about colonial resistance, which are more likely to be published. Stories addressing less visible oppressions, such as ethnic minorities within Black majority countries, struggle to gain traction. I think of the marginalization of the Ogoni, for example, in Nigeria, or Nubians in Sudan. Now, there's another aspect to this, the role of award ceremonies and recognition. The award systems exacerbate this hegemony. Winning a major prize often dictates which books receive global attention. Yet these awards are steeped in the same cultural biases that shape publishing. They frequently reward narratives that cater to Western sensibilities or confirm pre-existing stereotypes. And this is why scholars and readers alike must interrogate the systems that elevate certain voices while silencing others. Publishers must take more risks on narratives that may not initially appear profitable or mainstream, that may not be the big national novel of their country. Works that delve into indigenous oppressions, ethnic marginalization, and internalized power hierarchies. Scholars must focus beyond books published by large presses or those who have won international awards. Often the most authentic subaltern narratives emerge from self-published works or small independent publishers. While they are less visible, they provide invaluable insights into layered experiences of oppression. And so I'll stop here. I know that I've vastly overshot my time.